Hi everyone, it's Karen and I'm here at the Cool Tool Studio today to share with you guys how I made my patterned wire stacked rings. I absolutely love to use pattern wire for how detailed some of the patterns are. It's a super simple way to add quite a bit of visual interest to your pieces without a lot of work. If pattern wire did have a drawback, it would be that some of the more delicate designs tend to be very thin and as a result sort of flimsy. So they don't really have the structural integrity to stand alone as rings. However, when combined with and supported by other bands, they make complex looking rings that are an absolute snap to make. Before we get started, here's what we need for this project. I've got some 18 and 16 gauge sterling silver wire. I've got a variety of pattern wire, and then I have some flush cutters. I'm going to be soldering today, so I need an annealing pan. And I also have a honeycomb brick and then a soldering brick, some cross-lock tweezers, a solder pick, easy solder paste, and hard solder chip. I'm going to be needing to use some flux to prepare my metal and a flux brush. And then I've got a brazier torch. After my rings are soldered, I'm going to be forming them with a steel block, a rawhide mallet, and a ring mandrel. Then I'll be doing some cleanup with needle files, a 220-320 sanding block, a 400 sanding block, and a Scotch-Brite. I also have patina gel to finish them off. This ring was made by soldering individual rings that were then stacked together and soldered into the complete piece. I like to start by making my pattern wire bands first. I do this because the pattern wire could limit the sizes that you're able to cut to. For example, in this floral pattern wire, it would be a lot easier to cut and solder in between the flowers than on the flowers. So I might not be able to cut exactly to the right size, but you'll be able to nudge it to the correct size after it's been soldered using a ring mandrel and a rawhide mallet. I'm going to form my ring by wrapping the wire as tightly as I can around the ring mandrel. I'm going to shoot for a size 8, but we'll have to see how close the pattern wire lets me get to that size. See, if I were to try to be at an 8, I would be at a break in the flowers and a flower. So that's not going to quite work, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to end up cutting right on the outside edge of that flower, and it'll be a 7.5, but I'll be able to nudge it once it's been soldered to the correct size. So I'm just going to mark with a Sharpie around where I'm going to be cutting, and then slide off the ring mandrel. I'm going to cut using my flush cutters. So when you're using these, this is going to be the flush edge. If you were to cut with this facing the side that you're going to solder, it's going to cut to a point. So make sure you have the flat side facing the edge that you want to be flat. So there's my Sharpie line. I'm going to try to be straight. And I'm going to cut that excess off. So that should give me a pretty straight, good cut that I can go ahead and solder straight from. If you did cut at an angle and need to do cleanup, you can go ahead and file your edges with a needle file. I think this is going to be just fine. Before you solder, you want to make sure your edges meet up. And I actually find it's a little bit easier to not try for a perfect ring at this point. It's okay to kind of have an oval or a D. That way you can really make sure your edges are meeting up. You'll be able to make it round after it's been soldered. So just a little bit of fussing, and that looks good to me. We're ready to solder. I've got my ring here, and then Cool Tools sells pre-cut chip solder, which is super convenient. It's easy to accidentally use too much solder and accidentally fill the pattern of your wire. So use your solder sparingly, and these little chips are a great way to start. I'm going to be fluxing my ring. the seam there, inside and out. And then I like to set up my rings in a cross-lock tweezer just to make sure they don't run off on me while I'm trying to solder. So I also like to preheat my flux a little bit and then pick my solder over to it. I find that when I place my solder and then heat, sometimes the flux will move it elsewhere, and then I have to try to renegotiate while things are hot, and this is the way I prefer to do it. I'm going to start off by gently heating my ring. I'm going to do that until the flux runs clear, then I know it's not going to move too much. My solder is going to stay where I put it. That looks good. I'm going to come over and pick up my solder. I'm going to try to place it as close to my seam as I can. And I want to make sure I'm trying to heat both sides evenly. Apply a little heat from the bottom to make sure it pulls through. And that looks good. Now I'm going to put it in the pickle. My ring's been pickled, and now I'm ready to form it round. So since I made this guy kind of a deform while soldering, I need to round him back out again into a ring. I'm going to slide him onto my ring mandrel. And then I'm just going to gently tap it round with a rawhide mallet. So I wasn't able to make this exactly an 8 because of the pattern, so now I'm just going to very gently tap it down to the correct size. So that's almost sitting at an 8. Since it was soldered, the metal is fully annealed, and it's pretty easy to stretch it to the correct size. So I'm just going to tap it off my ring mandrel here. And then I'm going to gently mallet it flat. That way it'll easily sandwich between the two support bands. If I were to be using a more delicate pattern wire, you can just kind of gently press it flat, because if you were to mallet some of those, you'd just completely squish them. So now I'm ready to make the support bands that are going to sandwich this patterned wire. These support bands are great for not only adding structural integrity to the pattern wire, but they're also good for enclosing sharp edges and points that could catch on your clothes. I like to make a bunch of support bands all at once, and I'm going to do so by wrapping a coil around my ring mandrel. I've got my 16 gauge sterling silver wire, and again I'm shooting for an 8, but even though it's fully annealed, it's going to kind of spring once it's wrapped. So I'm going to wrap anywhere from 2 sizes to a size and a half smaller, and then let it relax and see where it falls before cutting. So this might take some kind of adjusting and back and forth dancing to get the right size. See, when I let this go, it's going to spring and fall past an 8. So I'm going to scoot it back up even higher and kind of set it down and twist it tighter, and then see if it springs to an 8, almost. So it'll be easier for you to do this if your wire is annealed. Cool Tools sells sterling silver dead soft, which is great. If you're not working with annealed wire, make sure you heat it up and anneal it before you try. So this is falling almost at an 8 if I stretch it, so that's probably good. And then I'm just going to go ahead and cut directly on the ring mandrel. And again, make sure you're using the correct flush cutting side of your cutters. So that's the 8. I'm going to wiggle it in there and cut. So I've got my flat edge there that's good to go for soldering. And if I were to cut again, I would make a point. So I want to make sure I rotate my flush cutters so that edge that's going to be cutting clean will meet up with the wire that I already cut. I'm going to wiggle that in, give it a snip. So there's one. And then since I've got these coiled, I might as well just keep on making them. This guy falls in 8. And then that's the pointy edge. So either you can file that, or if you're feeling lazy, you can use the flush cutters to get in there and trim that edge flat. I'm gonna rotate and cut again. Now I have my 2 support bands and we're gonna go to soldering. Before I solder this, I'm gonna wanna make sure that my ends line up as closely as possible. It just takes a little bit of fussing. I like to cross the wires past each other and try to let them kind of spring into where they're gonna rest. Maybe scoot it back a little bit too. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to apply a little bit of flux to my seam. And then I like to heat my ring first and then go over and pick up some solder. Looks like that flowed. I'm going to repeat this process on the other support band and give them both a pickle. My support bands have been pickled, and now's a good chance to clean up any extra solder blobs before you move on to soldering all the rings together, because it might just be a little bit easier to clean up those edges now. So just filing down a little extra solder. So now I'm going to clean up the scratches made from my file with my 220/320 sanding block. And then moving on to the 400. Looking good. And now I'm going to make sure these are perfectly round. I'm going to slide it onto my ring mandrel. And give it a tap. And then I want to make sure they're flat too. I'm going to repeat that with the other support ring. Now we're ready to assemble the ring. We're going to be soldering the individual rings together into a stack using paste solder. It's important that if your studio isn't equipped with ventilation, that you use a fume extractor. Now that I have my individual rings soldered, formed, and flattened, I'm ready to solder them together into the finished piece. I'm going to start by applying easy paste solder, and you could do medium, but by going from hard to easy, you just give yourself a little more wiggle room with the heat onto the band here. So I'm going to set that on top of my firing brick. And then I'm going to take my pattern wire and set that ring on top there. And then I'm going to apply paste to the other ring. And then I'm going to flip it, so go solder side down on top of the pattern wire ring there. And I'm just going to do a little bit of fussing to get everyone nice and lined up. Sometimes it helps to use a pick to nudge from the inside. I'm just going to do some fussing until this is nice and lined up. I've got my rings positioned and I'm ready to solder them all together. I like to gently heat the pieces a hole. If you're working with a really delicate pattern wire in the middle, you might have to focus some of your heat on the support rings. That way they get hot before you melt your pattern wire. Start off gently. If you come on too aggressively, your paste might move and shift your piece while you're soldering. Kind of give the bottom a little bit of extra love. And the top there. And I'm looking for a flash of my solder. And it's kind of hard to see the lights, but it looks like it's gone. So now I'm going to give my ring a pickle and see how we did. Once your ring is done in the pickle, look it over to see if there's any solder you need to clean up. If there is, clean it up using your needle files and sanding blocks. After that, you can finish them however you'd like. I finished my rings by using patina gel and then giving them a tumble. I've got my finished ring here. These stacked rings are a super quick and satisfying project, and it's easy to make a whole pile of them all at once. I hope you give stacked pattern wire rings a try. They're a lot of fun to make. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.